Now then, I wonder how many of you are involved in committees and meetings. Put your hand up if you are involved in a committee or a meeting, okay? Keep your hand up if you're involved in more than one committee or meeting. There are still quite a few hands up. Anybody more than 6 meetings? You can go outside the church if you're involved in other organizations. A few of you more than 6. I did a quick tally for myself. I got to 12 and I lost count. Can anybody beat that? It's part of my calling. Okay. I must be a really good Christian, mustn't I, if I go to that many committees. It does sometimes feel that it's a mark of discipleship how many meetings we go to. It's not true, by the way, but it can sometimes feel like that. Who enjoys going to meetings? Who thinks they're the best part of church life? Oh, yeah, you're having me on. Right, okay, that's fine. I was doing some work with some folks gathered from around the synod. We were looking at what might make good meetings. I was doing that because, number one, we do seem to have an awful lot of them in the life of the church. It's hard to imagine the life of the church without meetings. Number 2 is, but they're not always the highlight of our church life together. I do hear a lot of moanings about the number of meetings we have. But number 3, when you just sort of unpack it and look at it from a distance, surely the life of the church has to be about meetings. It's of the essence of our calling of Christians that we seek ways of embodying the love of God together. So there might be some work, important work for us to do to see, I wonder what it would be like to have good meetings, fulfilling meetings, meetings that actually feel like they are an expression of that joy we have of, as disciples of Jesus, rejoice and be glad, because yours is the kingdom of God. I wonder how often we've gone out of meetings singing that in our hearts, if not with our voices. So I was talking earlier on about that point in the Christian year we are, when the theme of discipleships is very much to the fore. As we move through Epiphany away from Christmas, as the baby Jesus, we see him. Now we've got the adult Jesus beginning his public ministry, and critically that involves the calling of disciples. And it would be very easy at this point to see the story that we're involved in as a very individual one. How Jesus called Simon Peter, how Jesus called Andrew, how Jesus called James, how Jesus called John. And to ask the very relevant and pertinent question, so what does it mean for me to leave my nets, or to leave my boat, or to leave my father with the hired servants? That's a story that we'll know well of the call of the disciples. And now as we arrive at the Beatitudes, and what might it be for me to actually embody the blessing of God to the poor in spirit? What might it be for me to be one of those people of whom it can be said, blessed are you because you work for peace, you are a peacemaker? And that would be a good and a helpful message to draw from this season. But I don't think we should ignore the fact, even as we hear these stories early in the gospel of Jesus calling disciples, and then through the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's gospel, giving them the substance of this life to which they are called, that this is also a call into community. This is certainly initially a calling to the 12. 12 who are going to not only be a group of people who will work together to be partners in Jesus in his earthly ministry, the 12 disciples, You wonder if you could call them the first church meeting or stewards or elders meeting. Can you imagine Jesus chairing that meeting and asking for matters arising from the minutes of the last meeting? I don't think that's quite how it happened. But you get that sense that the disciples are being called into community, and of course they are also deeply representative. Why are there 12? To represent the 12 tribes of Israel. This is something about this new community that Jesus is to form, the new community of faithful, of the children of God. So even at its beginning, even if, as we have those individuals called by Jesus by name, it is absolutely a calling into community. And those qualities about which we heard in the Beatitudes are surely also qualities of this community into which they are called. A community in which no matter how poor or rich people feel themselves to be, they are included within this gracious embrace of God's love. No matter how meek people might feel in the eyes of the world, they are deeply valued within this community. That's what I hear going on amongst this call to discipleship. And then we come to our little bit from Paul's letter, the first letter of Paul, to the Corinthians. I know Paul isn't always easy to hear because his letters can get a little bit complicated. You might have heard, I don't know, you might have heard last Sunday the bit that comes before this, which would have given us a good clue as to what's going on here, because 1 Corinthians famously is a letter that Paul is writing to the Corinthian church, but which has become divided. And in the immediately preceding passage, he's talked about they have broken into factions. Some are saying, I'm for Paul. Some are saying, I'm for Apollos. And some are saying, I'm for Cephas, or Simon Peter. And some are saying, I am Christ. And you can just imagine that group of early Christians, after their worship, all gathering into little corners, depending on whose allegiance they happen to be leaning towards. And it's causing division, it's causing fractions, it's causing upset within the life of the church, and that is the prompt for Paul's writing. Now, when you think about it, we're actually only about 20-something years from the story of the call of the first disciples. This is only a few decades after the very first inkling that something special was happening in the arrival of Jesus. But already we've got to this stage where, and here are people surely in Corinth who themselves have heard the call of Jesus and would count themselves disciples of Jesus. But somehow we've arrived at this rather dysfunctional place where individual discipleship is not leading to, let's go back to the jigsaw picture of a nice complete picture, but of people going off in different directions and the whole thing pulling apart. So what's going on? And is that some clue there for how we might think about what it means when we gather together, whether for worship or for our meetings? That's what I'm thinking. What's going on in Corinth, almost certainly, I think, and this is just a human thing, it's what we do as well, is that those Christians are bringing things into the church from their experience in the world, from the way in which they are shaped by the community around them. Just very briefly, Corinth, firstly, it was a very religious place, actually, as most places in the then Roman Empire would have been, drawing on Greek culture with all its many gods. You might think that was an advantage to the church, that this is a very religious society. But of course, it's a society where there are many gods and people have many allegiances. And though, of course, they wouldn't have used this term, you might describe it very much as a pick and mix religion. What suits me? Which particular God, which particular theological influence do I think will work out for me? And can't you just see how they brought that attitude? And here they should be all fellow disciples of Jesus, but they're starting to divide off, just as they would have been out in their cultural context, where when you went to visit your neighbour, they might have a different God to you. And they brought that in to the life of the church. Corinth is actually a very successful city, a port, a major hub of commerce. And so here's a very proud city, and where success really matters. You know, it really matters that you are part of this very successful city. And so it's about being on the winning team. That's what matters to the world outside of the church. And I have a suspicion that these early Christians have brought something of that into their life in the church. And finally, Corinth was a very layered society. Of course, there were slaves at the bottom. There was really then quite a big gap, and then a really wealthy elite at the top, those who were making all the profits from all the trade that was going on, and not a huge amount in between. The idea of social mobility, forget it. It just wouldn't happen. And again, that attitude of mind, that framing, these Christians have brought into the life of the church. So what is Paul trying to do as he writes his letter to the Christian Corinthians? I think the word I would use, and I'm using it because it's the word we were using when we were talking about meetings in the 21st century in the United Reformed Church and in local ecumenical partnerships, is the word he's trying to reframe the question. And I love that word, reframing, because we all bring a frame with us into the church. The way I describe it is this. I used to do quite a lot of cycling. I don't do any now, but I used to do a lot of cycling. I also drive. When I have a handlebar in front of me, the road looks very different from when I've got a steering wheel in front of me. I can be just as frustrated as you as the cyclist cycling two abreast when I'm trying to get somewhere in a hurry. When I'm behind a handlebar, I absolutely know this road, I have as much right to be here as anybody else, and you'll jolly well wait for me, and you will look after my safety, and you'll give me a wide berth. Yeah, I'm framed differently depending on what's in front of me. And Paul is presenting these Corinthian Christians with a new framework in which to think about the way in which they relate to each other. And he's drawing on a theme which will actually be really dominant in 1 Corinthians, but the foolishness or the apparent foolishness of the gospel. This understanding of what God is doing in Jesus Christ that in worldly terms makes no sense at all. But once you are part of the life of the church, a disciple of Jesus, and you discover that relationship with Jesus for yourself, suddenly you realize how the saving work of God is taking place. It's reframing around this idea of the apparent foolishness of God. Paul actually says, consider again your calling. Consider how you were first calling. He's taking his disciples back to how this story began. Reframe your relationships in this church around that and not the things you brought in from the world round about you. So I wonder what we can bring then into our own experience, our lived experience of being the church. I'd like to suggest 3 ways in which we could attempt to frame all of our gatherings when we meet together. And the first is, just as Paul said to the Corinthians, consider your calling. Consider your calling. When we meet together, wouldn't it be important to say that we are disciples together? Each one of us has heard that call and in our own way is seeking to live out in obedience to how Jesus has called us. Wouldn't it be great if every space where we gather together, it was a space where vocation was absolutely to the core? That sense of respecting one another because we are fellow disciples of Jesus. To have that frame always before us as we think about how we relate to each other. The second thing is, and then coming right back to that sense of from the beginning discipleship was being brought into a new community, that whenever we meet, this is a shared space. This is a space that we discover together, that we create, that we co-create together. It's a space in which every voice matters. Sometimes when we have meetings, and not just in the church, everywhere, a few voices are the ones that are heard. Those who can maybe think quickly or in positions of knowledge or just because of their temperament. There are techniques, of course, we can use to try to enable others. But I think fundamentally to have that frame that every story matters. This is a space we co-create as disciples of Jesus. And the third thing I'd say, as we think, how do we frame our gatherings in our own context? That we are a diverse group, and that diversity is part of what God gives to us. It is God's gift to us. That diversity can lead us into potential conflict, as it did, or appears to be doing in the Corinthian church. But difference isn't automatically a problem. Difference is also a gift. How do we handle when we see things differently? How do we handle it well and respectfully and creatively? And say, well, this is something of God for us to work through, not something to be afraid of and to run away from or to escalate into some kind of holy war between each other. But to handle diversity well within the life of the church is absolutely part of our calling and goes right back to, and how do we make this a place of vocation where together we are disciples of Jesus? The church is the place where those of us who have heard the call of Jesus and responded in our own hearts come together so that we can be that community that gives expression to what God is doing for the world in Jesus Christ. We are diverse, but we are one.